10,000 years ago, the world was full. Not full the way it is now, not full of cities and roads and the low hum of machines, full in the older sense, full of movement. Herds of gazelle crossed the hillsides of what we now call the Middle East in numbers that would seem impossible today. The forests of Europe ran unbroken from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the steppe. The rivers of the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land curving through modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, flooded every spring and left behind black soil so rich that wild wheat grew in stands thick enough to harvest with your hands. Almonds, pistachios, wild barley, the land gave and kept giving. The people who lived here, small bands, extended families, rarely more than a few dozen, had learned to read this world the way we read a language. They knew which plants came first in spring and which ones lasted into the cold. They knew where the gazelle watered at dusk. They knew the hills and the valleys and the seasonal rivers across territories spanning hundreds of miles. They had been doing this for 300,000 years, 30 times longer than everything we call civilization has existed. They were not struggling. These people, 10,000 years ago, were living in one of the most abundant landscapes the planet had ever produced. They ate 80, sometimes 100 different foods across a year. They were tall, their bones were dense, their teeth were clean. They were, by the hard measure of what ancient bone can tell us, among the healthiest human beings who have ever lived. And then something shifted, not all at once, not with a single discovery. It began in a handful of places. The hills of southern Turkey, the banks of the Jordan River, where certain groups began doing something small, staying a little longer than they had before, scattering seeds near the camp before they left, coming back to find something waiting. It seemed in every way that mattered like a good idea. Among these people, somewhere in the hills of Anatolia around 7000 BCE, was a woman. We don't have her name. We have her bones. She was part of one of the first communities that had made the full shift, a settlement called Çatalhöyük, 8,000 people in the river plains of what is now central Turkey, the largest human settlement that had ever existed on Earth. She stood at the edge of a field she had planted herself. The grain was heavy in her hands. She had worked 3 months for this harvest, and her grandmother had never worked like this. Her grandmother had walked, had moved with the herds and the seasons, had eaten what the land offered in its changing variety, had belonged to no single piece of ground. That life was gone now. This woman had a field and a storage pit and a mud brick room she entered through a hole in the roof, and 8,000 neighbors pressed so tightly against her that there were no streets between the buildings. She had civilization's first attempt at a city. She pressed the grain to her chest. She was glad. She did not know what it was costing her. Her teeth were rotting. Slowly, invisibly, a consequence of a diet built on grain year after year, the same narrow corridor of food that her body was never designed to run on. 1 in 8 adults in her settlement already had cavities. Her grandmother's teeth had been clean. Her grandmother had eaten from the full breadth of the world. Her children were 4 centimeters shorter than her grandparents had been. The bones show this. Early farmers across the ancient world shrank, not from hunger, but from the narrowing of the diet, from the loss of the protein and fat and scattered nutrients that a varied life provides. They were fed. They were just fed, unless. Her neighbor, 3 rooftops away, had a healed dent in her skull, round and precise, the shape of a clay ball fired from a sling. 1 in 4 skulls at Çatalhöyük carries that mark, the signature of a settlement where 8,000 people lived in permanent proximity, competing for resources that were always a bad harvest away from running short. Her grandmother's people had moved when things grew scarce. This woman could not move. The grain was in the ground. The settlement needed tending. She could not leave. That is the detail that contains the whole story. She could not leave. Not because anyone was stopping her, but because the logic of what she had built made leaving impossible. There were too many mouths now for the wild land to feed. The settlement had grown beyond what the land around it could support without the grain. Without the grain, people starved. Without people, the grain went unplanted. She was not a prisoner. She was something more permanent than a prisoner. She was dependent. And her children would be more dependent than she was. And their children more still. Because the farmers were spreading, not because their lives were better, but because they produced more children. A woman who stays, who weans her babies onto grain porridge, falls pregnant again sooner than a woman who walks. More children meant more mouths. More mouths meant more cleared land. More cleared land meant less of the wild world her grandmother had lived inside. Within a few generations, the people who had chosen to keep walking, the ones who were taller, healthier, freer, who worked 20 hours a week and ate 100 different foods, were simply outnumbered, absorbed, forgotten. Here's what no one tells you about grain. Grain can be stored. A gazelle cannot be stored. A fig cannot be stored. The wild barley her grandmother gathered and ate in the field, that could not be stored either, not in any quantity, not for any length of time. But cultivated grain, dried and kept in a sealed pit, lasts for months, for years. And that changes everything. Because now, for the first time in 300,000 years of human life, there is something worth taking. Her grandmother's people carried everything they owned. There was nothing to raid, nothing to seize, nothing to tax. You could kill them, but you could not extract wealth from them, because they had no wealth that stayed still long enough to extract. But the storage pit, the pit beneath this settlement, filled with the grain from 3 months of labor, that stays still. And the people who filled it cannot leave it behind. Someone has to guard it. And the person who guards it, or the family or the clan, strong enough to station themselves between the grain and everyone who needs it, now hold something that has never existed before in human history. Not just food, leverage, the ability to say, work for me and you eat, refuse and you do not. This is not a decision anyone made. No one sat down and invented inequality. It grew the way mold grows, quietly in the dark, in the right conditions. The right conditions were a storage pit and hungry people and one family standing between them. Within a few generations, that family is a class. Within a few more, the class has a name and a title, and a portion of every harvest owed to them by custom, then by law, then by the threat of men with weapons who also need to eat and have made their arrangement with the family accordingly. The landlord, the tax collector, the soldier, the priest who says the grain belongs to the gods and he speaks for the gods. None of them invented themselves. All of them are the logical conclusion of one woman pressing harvested grain to her chest in a field she could not leave. She thought she had made a better life. She had made us. She had made our cities and our diseases, our art and our armies, our capacity to build cathedrals, and our talent for building prisons. She had made the world in which the wealthiest, most medicated, most protected people alive are still shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, still plagued by the diseases of a diet the human body never fully adapted to, still working, by almost any measure, longer hours than the people who lived before the harvest. She pressed the grain to her chest. The storage pit was full. 8,000 people breathed the same smoky air above the rooftops of the settlement she could not leave. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of the agricultural revolution, and this, all of this, is why it was the worst mistake the human race ever made. To understand how the agricultural revolution is the worst mistake in human history, You have to first understand what the world was before it. And that world looked nothing like what we've been told. Go back 12,000 years. Go back to the landscape that existed before the first field was ever cleared, before the first seed was ever deliberately pressed into soil. The Middle East, the arc of land we now call the Fertile Crescent, curving from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean through what is today Turkey, Syria, Iraq, down toward the Persian Gulf, looked nothing like it does now. The rolling scrublands of modern Syria, the dusty plains of Iraq, and the parched hills of Jordan. Forget all of it. 12,000 years ago, this was a different world. The hillsides of Anatolia were thick with oak and pistachio forests. Wild almonds grew in the valleys. The Jordan River ran clear and cold through marshlands so dense with waterfowl that a single morning on the water could feed a family for days. And across the open grasslands of the Levant, in herds so large they would seem impossible to modern eyes, moved the gazelle. Not dozens, not hundreds, tens of thousands of gazelle, crossing the hillsides in seasonal migrations that the people who watched them had tracked for generations. The gazelle was the engine of life in the pre-agricultural Fertile Crescent, the most reliable, most abundant source of protein in the landscape. And the people who lived here knew its movements the way a sailor knows the tide. They knew which passes the herds would funnel through in autumn. They knew the watering holes. They knew from the behavior of a single lead animal at the edge of a herd what the 1,000 behind it were about to do. This knowledge had been accumulating for so long that it had become something like instinct, passed from grandparent to grandchild across hundreds of generations, refined and deepened and never written down because it didn't need to be written down. It lived in people. These were the Natufians. That is what archaeologists call them, named for Wadi en-Natuf, a valley in what is now the West Bank where their remains were first identified. They lived across the Levant from roughly 12,500 to 9,500 BCE in the millennia just before agriculture arrived, and they have been almost completely misunderstood by the history that came after them. The image most people carry of pre-agricultural humans is of something barely surviving, huddled around fires, scratching for roots in frozen ground, perpetually cold, perpetually hungry, perpetually afraid of the dark and the wolves in the winter. It is an image built backward from the assumption that farming was an improvement, that if people adopted it, they must have needed it, must have been desperate enough to work that hard for it. But the Natufians were not desperate. The landscape they lived in was not hostile. It was, by any reasonable ecological measure, extraordinarily generous. They ate gazelle and deer and wild boar. They ate fish from the Jordan River and waterfowl from the marshes. They harvested wild emmer wheat and wild barley from stands so dense that a single family working with flint sickles could gather enough grain in 3 weeks to last an entire year. They collected almonds and pistachios from the forests of the Carmel Hills. They ate wild lentils and chickpeas, wild figs and acorns. In a good season, and most seasons were good because the climate of the Levant in this period was wetter and milder than it is today. The landscape around them was essentially a stocked pantry that required no management. It simply produced, and they moved through it, taking what they needed, leaving the rest to recover. The result was a diet of staggering variety. Not the variety of a modern supermarket, which is abundance of a particular kind. Hundreds of products derived from a handful of plants. The variety of a wild world, dozens of genuinely distinct food sources, each with its own nutritional profile, each contributing something the others didn't. Protein from the gazelle, fat from the nuts, complex carbohydrates from the wild grain, micronutrients from the legumes, and the wild plants that farmers would eventually stop eating because farmers don't eat everything. They eat what they grow. This variety wrote itself into the bodies of the people who lived it. The skeletons of pre-agricultural people in the Fertile Crescent are, by the measures archaeologists use, impressive, tall, dense in the bone, well-muscled with the kind of skeletal robustness that comes from a physically active, nutritionally varied life. Their teeth, and this matters, and we will come back to it, were clean. Cavities were rare. Tooth decay was the exception, not the rule, because a diet built on meat and nuts and wild plants does not create the same acid environment in the mouth that a diet built on grain does. The mouths of hunter-gatherers, preserved in their skulls 10,000 years later, still speak of health. And they were not, despite everything the word primitive implies, simple people. The Natufians built permanent stone houses, round, semi-subterranean, their floors dug into the earth for insulation, their walls raised from dry stone and timber. At the site of Ain Malaha, in what is now northern Israel, archaeologists found a village of circular stone dwellings that had been occupied continuously for centuries. Not a campsite, a village. Each with hearths and storage pits and a cemetery where the dead were buried with personal ornaments. Carved bone pendants, shells from the Mediterranean coast, beads of stone that had been carried hundreds of miles. At one burial at Ain Malaha, an elderly person was interred with a puppy placed deliberately at their hand. Someone had loved that dog. Someone had thought in 12,000 BCE that the dog should go with them. These people made art, carved animal figurines from bone and stone, bears, wildcats, the animals of the world they inhabited. They conducted ceremonies. They feasted at their funerals, leaving behind the bones of animals consumed in communal meals around the graves of their dead. They had what any honest observer would have to call a rich social world. Relationships, obligations, rituals, memory, and in the full texture of human community. They were not waiting to become civilized. They were already civilized in all the ways that actually matter. And here's the fact that most changes how you see everything that follows. They were not working very hard. This is the detail that collapses the standard story. When anthropologists study the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, the Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Akta of the Philippines, they find the same pattern everywhere. These people, living in environments that are far less generous than the pre-agricultural Fertile Crescent, devote somewhere between 14 and 20 hours a week to obtaining food. 14 to 20 hours. The rest of the week is theirs. They sleep. They talk. They play with their children. They visit neighboring bands. They make music and tell stories and conduct the elaborate ceremonies that keep their social world coherent. 12,000 years before the 40-hour workweek was invented, the people of the pre-agricultural Middle East were doing something that the agricultural civilization which replaced them has never quite managed to offer the majority of its inhabitants. They had time. Time is not a trivial thing. And time is what you use to be human in the full sense, to think, to play, to love, to grieve, to make things that have no immediate practical purpose, but that matter anyway. The cave paintings of Lascaux were made by hunter-gatherers 30,000 years before the first field was ever plowed. The carved limestone pillars at Göbekli Tepe, which we will come to shortly, were raised by people who had never planted a single seed. The oldest known bread in the world, a flatbread made from wild grain and tuber flour, was baked 14,000 years ago at a Natufian site in Jordan's northeastern desert, 4,000 years before agriculture existed. These were not people at the edge of their capacity, desperately inventing farming to survive. They were people with enough food, enough time, enough cognitive surplus to build temples and bake bread and bury their dogs with love. And in this world of enough, a structural fact sustained something that would not survive the agricultural transition: equality. Not equality in the modern political sense. Not a consciously held value, not a law, not a declaration. A structural outcome of how they ate. Here is how it worked. In a world where food is wild and scattered and always moving, where the gazelle herd is 20 miles east today and 40 miles west tomorrow, where the nut harvest is abundant this valley and thin the next, where no single source provides enough to live on. It is almost impossible for any person or group to gain control over food supply. You cannot store the gazelle. You cannot tax the wild barley. You cannot position yourself between the pistachio trees and the people who need them, because the trees are everywhere, the people move, and your monopoly dissolves the moment someone walks in a different direction. This is the structural basis of hunter-gatherer equality. Power in any society flows from control of something people need. And in the pre-agricultural world, what people needed was too diffuse, too mobile, and too abundant for any single person to control it. The Natufian bands had leaders, people whose knowledge, skill, or personal authority made them influential. But those leaders could not accumulate at others' expense. They could not extract. They could not pass their advantage to their children in any form that would compound across generations. The ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer societies is remarkably consistent on this point. When someone starts accumulating more than their share, the band's response is immediate and social. It is called leveling, ridicule, ostracism, the withdrawal of cooperation. The mechanisms vary. The outcome is the same. Hoarding is not tolerated because hoarding in a mobile band that shares resources is an existential threat to everyone else. The result was a world without landlords, without tax collectors, without slaves, not because these people were morally superior to the civilizations that followed. They weren't. They were human, with all the violence and jealousy and tribalism that comes with it. But because the structure of their food system made those things impossible to sustain. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. The world that existed in the Fertile Crescent 12,000 years ago, the world before the first field was cleared, before the first seed was pressed deliberately into soil, was in many measurable ways a better world for the average human body than anything that would follow it for the next 10,000 years. The food was more varied. The bodies were taller and stronger. The work was less. The inequality was lower. The diseases that would define human suffering for the entirety of recorded history, the epidemics, the famines, the chronic diseases of a narrow diet, had not yet arrived. This was not paradise. Let no one suggest it was paradise. People died of infections that could now be cured with a single course of antibiotics. Infant mortality was high. Violence between bands was real, if intermittent. Childbirth was dangerous. A broken leg could kill you. Life was hard in the ways that life without modern medicine is always hard. But within those constraints, within the framework of what was possible for human beings living without metal or writing or germ theory, the Natufians of the pre-agricultural Fertile Crescent were doing extraordinarily well. And they didn't know it. That is perhaps the saddest part. They didn't know they were living at what would turn out to be, for most of the people who came after them, the high water mark of ordinary human health and freedom. They were just living, hunting the gazelle, gathering the wild grain, burying their dead with love, watching their children grow into bodies that were 4 centimeters taller than the farmers their grandchildren would become. They didn't know that something was already changing, not in them, and in the climate. And the climate was about to do something that would set in motion the longest, slowest, most consequential transformation in human history. Not because it made the old life impossible overnight, but because it made one small new behavior logical. And that small new behavior, like all the great catastrophes, would compound. To understand how the agricultural revolution became the worst mistake in human history, you have to understand how it started. And the answer overturns everything we were taught. It did not start with hunger. It did not start with a clever invention or a desperate people scratching at frozen ground, finally discovering that seeds could be planted. The people who set this catastrophe in motion were the same healthy, well-fed, and free-ranging hunter-gatherers we just described. People with enough food, enough time, and enough ambition to do something that should have taken centuries of civilizational development to attempt. They built a monument. In the hill country of what is now southeastern Turkey, 11,600 years ago, bands of hunter-gatherers quarried massive limestone pillars, some 5 meters tall, some weighing 10 tons, and hauled them up a hill above the Harran Plain. They carved those pillars with foxes and vultures and scorpions and lions. They raised them in precise circles, one enclosure after another, across 15 centuries of continuous effort. The site predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It was built before pottery, before the wheel, before a single domesticated plant existed anywhere on Earth. This place, Göbekli Tepe, is where the trap was first baited. Not deliberately, not by anyone who understood what they were beginning. That is precisely what makes it so important. Look at what was carved into those pillars, and you learn something about who built them. Not grain, not cattle, not any of the tame, cultivated world that farming would later produce. The animals at Göbekli Tepe are wild, predators, foxes with bared teeth, vultures spreading their wings over headless human figures, scorpions, boars, the full, dangerous, alive world of people who had never tried to tame it, who had lived inside it for 300,000 years and carved what they saw into stone with a skill and confidence that still impresses today. These were not desperate people. They were not at the edge of survival. They were people with enough surplus time and enough social organization to coordinate a building project of extraordinary scale across multiple generations. And they were doing it not for food or shelter, but for something the human mind has always been willing to exhaust itself for: the sacred, the gathering, the ritual that holds a people together across the distances of a nomadic life. And it is that gathering, not the monument itself, but the human need to keep returning to it, that accidentally started the worst mistake in human history. Here is the mechanism. Here is how a temple becomes a farm. When a band of 30 hunter-gatherers moves through a landscape, the land barely notices them. They take a little, move on, the land recovers. But Göbekli Tepe was not a passing-through place. It was a destination. Hundreds of people, from bands scattered across perhaps 100 miles of Anatolian hill country, made periodic journeys to this site, to gather, to feast, to build, to participate in whatever ceremonies the pillars were meant to hold. They came back, season after season, generation after generation, and every time they came, they needed to eat. Feeding a large gathering in one fixed location repeatedly over decades is a problem that the wild landscape cannot solve indefinitely. The gazelle learn to avoid a place where they are hunted too often. The wild grain stands near the site, gets stripped faster than they can reseed. The abundance that had always seemed inexhaustible begins, quietly, to thin. And so the people responsible for feeding these gatherings began doing something small. Clearing the brush from around the wild grain stands closest to the site, scattering some of the harvested seeds back into the cleared ground before leaving, coming back the following season to find a slightly larger, slightly more reliable stand waiting for them. It was not farming. It had no name. It was a practical response to a practical problem, a way to make the land near the gathering place a little more generous, a little more predictable. But predictability, once introduced, demands more predictability. A slightly larger grain stand one season becomes an expectation the next. The expectation becomes a dependency, and the dependency means you come back, not just for the ceremony, but for the harvest. And while you are back, you might as well tend the stand a little more, clear a little more, scatter a little more seed. The temple had created the farm, not in a moment of decision, in 1,000 small, reasonable steps, each one responding to the pressure created by the last. We'll come to see how, by anchoring ourselves to the soil, we birthed a new architecture of suffering. The need to defend fixed territory invented organized warfare, while the creation of food surpluses gave rise to the ruling class and the institution of slavery. We'll come to see exactly how all these play out later. For now, we are in Göbekli Tepe, and the people of Göbekli Tepe were not making a civilizational error. They were solving a problem that their own spiritual ambition had created. And the solution to that problem: manage the land a little more, stay a little longer, come back a little more reliably, planted the seed in every sense of everything that followed. By the time Göbekli Tepe was abandoned, around 8,200 BCE, buried deliberately, this enclosure by enclosure, filled with rubble and sealed under the hill as if someone wanted to put it away. The process it had started was already running on its own momentum. 20 miles to the northwest, the first domesticated wheat in the world was already growing. The temple was gone. The farm had arrived. And in the river valleys and hill slopes across the whole arc of the Fertile Crescent, the same logic was playing out simultaneously. Not because anyone had communicated it from one place to another, but because the conditions were similar everywhere, and the human response to those conditions followed the same steps every time. Gather, return, feed the gathering, manage the land, depend on the management. Everywhere the process began, it followed the same direction. Nowhere did it reverse. The drift had started. And a drift, meant if it runs long enough in one direction, stops being a drift. It becomes the shape of the world. The first thing you need to understand about the agricultural revolution is something counterintuitive. Nobody made it happen. There was no decision, no morning when a person looked at a wild grain stand and thought, "I will farm this." No single generation that chose a different life. The worst mistake our species ever made was not made deliberately. It crept in. And that is what makes it so hard to see and so impossible to undo. The process had a name, though the people living through it would never have had words for it. Archaeologists call it the drift, a slow, barely visible slide from one way of living into another, driven not by vision or ambition, but by the accumulation of small, sensible responses to immediate pressures. In each response, reasonable, each one making the next step more likely. And the whole chain, seen across 2,000 years, pointing in only one direction. To feel how this worked, you have to follow one community through it. On the banks of the Euphrates River in what is now northern Syria, around 13,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers built a village. Not a camp, a village. Round huts of timber and reed, semi-permanent, meant to be returned to. They called nothing by the name we now use for their home, Abu Huraira. But they lived there, season after season, drawn back by the same thing that had drawn the Natufians to their stone houses in the Carmel Hills: the extraordinary generosity of the land around them. The Euphrates Valley in this period was lush in ways the modern Syrian desert gives no hint of. Oak and pistachio forest covered the hills. The river meadows grew wild rye and einkorn wheat in dense stands that a family could harvest in weeks. And every summer, without fail, the gazelle came, vast herds moving along their ancient migration routes through the valley, and the people of Abu Huraira were ready for them, hunting communally, taking enormous quantities of meat in a short window, processing and storing what they couldn't eat immediately. It was a life built on reliable abundance, not ease exactly, but reliability. The land kept its promises. For 500 years they lived this way. Then the climate changed. Around 12,800 years ago, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped sharply and without warning. What triggered it is still debated: a collapse of ocean currents, a sudden influx of meltwater from retreating glaciers, possibly something that fell from the sky. The details don't matter as much as the result. The rains that had fed the oak forests and the wild grain stands of the Euphrates Valley became unreliable, then scarce, then, in some years, barely there at all. The forest retreated. The wild grain stands thinned. One by one, the plant foods the people of Abu Huraira had built their lives around disappeared from the landscape around their village. The gazelle migration faltered. The herds that had come reliably every summer began to follow different routes, or come in smaller numbers, or not come at all in the worst years. Most of the community left, followed the food as their ancestors had always done, as the logic of a nomadic life demanded. A smaller group stayed. Why they stayed is not recorded anywhere. It never could be. These people had no writing. But the ground they left behind tells part of the story. Among the ashes and the floor deposits of their huts, preserved by the dry Syrian air across 13,000 years, archaeologists found seeds. Not just wild seeds, seeds showing the first, faint signs of cultivation. The people who stayed had begun to plant. Not farming. Not yet. Something less than farming, something that had no name at the time, and barely has one now. They were managing. When the wild rye that still grew in patches near the village produced seeds, they harvested some and scattered others back into the ground. When competing plants grew up around the rye stand, they cleared them. They were doing, in other words, exactly what a sensible person does when a reliable food source begins to fail. They put work into protecting and extending what remained. This is the mechanism that turned the human world inside out, not a revolution, a ratchet. Here is how the ratchet works. You manage a small patch of wild grain to get through a bad season. The next season, the patch is slightly more productive because you cleared competing vegetation, because the seeds you scattered grew, because the plants whose seeds were hardest to harvest have gradually been replaced, generation by generation, by the plants whose seeds stayed on the stalk long enough to be collected. You harvest more. You scatter more back. The patch grows. More people can be fed from it. More people means more labor to tend it. More tending means a larger patch next season. And here's the part that closes the trap. The grain you now depend on has changed. Wild grain shatters when it ripens. The seeds fall to the ground and scatter, which is how a wild plant reproduces. But the seeds that made it into your harvest were the ones that hadn't shattered yet. You planted those. The shatterers fell to the ground and were lost. Season after season, without any conscious intention, you selected against the wild trait and toward the domestic one. The grain that grew from your planted seeds was slightly less likely to shatter. The next generation, slightly less still. After 2,000 years of this unconscious selection, the grain you grow cannot reproduce without you. It needs to be harvested, threshed, and replanted by human hands. It has become dependent on you. And you have become dependent on it. This is the moment the trap closed, not with a sound, not with a feeling of finality, with the quiet arithmetic of mutual dependency. The community at Abu Huraira that had stayed through the drought had grown over the generations into something their ancestors would not have recognized. More people, because a settled community with a reliable grain supply can support more children, and more children survive. More mouths meant the grain supply had to be larger. A larger grain supply required more tended land. More tended land required more people to tend it. The numbers fed on each other, growing together, each increase in population requiring a corresponding increase in cultivation, each expansion of cultivation producing the food that allowed the population to grow again. By the time the climate warmed again, around 11,700 years ago, when the rains returned and the oak forests began to creep back across the hills, the people living at Abu Huraira could not simply go back to the way their ancestors had lived. There were too many of them. The wild land could not feed that many mouths. The grain was in the ground. The harvest was coming. The choice, if it could be called a choice, had already been made by the accumulated weight of 1,000 previous seasons. They were farmers now, not because they had decided to become farmers, because every single step along the way had made the next step feel necessary. What happened at Abu Huraira was not unique to Abu Huraira. That is the most important thing to understand about this chapter of the worst mistake in human history. The same process, settling near abundant food, climate pressure arriving, managing wild plants to compensate, becoming dependent on the managed plants, losing the ability to reverse, played out simultaneously across the entire arc of the Fertile Crescent. In the Jordan Valley, where wild figs and wild barley grew along the riverbanks. In the hill country of Anatolia, where the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe had already begun pulling people toward the same patch of hillside season after season. In the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in what is now Iran. In every pocket of abundance where people had settled near a reliable food source and built a life around it. Not because the people of these different places were communicating with each other, coordinating a transition, agreeing to give up the old life. But because the conditions were similar, the pressures were similar, and the human response to those pressures, manage what you have, stay close to what you manage, depend on what you stay close to, followed the same logic everywhere it appeared. The drift, in other words, was not a local accident. It was a pattern built into the relationship between human beings and certain plants, waiting to be triggered by the right combination of settlement and pressure. Once triggered, it ran the same way every time. The only question was how long it took before the ratchet had clicked far enough that going back was no longer possible. There is a detail from Abu Huraira that stays with you. The bones of the women who lived there in the farming period, not the hunter-gatherer period. The farming period show a specific deformation in their toes, their knees, and their lower backs. It comes from kneeling. Hours every day for years, kneeling over grinding stones to turn grain into flour. The skeletons of the women who lived through the agricultural transition at Abu Huraira carry the permanent mark of that labor in their very bones. Their bodies were shaped by the work that the new life required. Their grandmothers' bodies had not looked like this. Their grandmothers had walked, had ranged across a wide territory, eating from the full variety of what the land offered, working hard in the way that hunting and gathering demands, but never spending hours every day in a single repetitive posture that warped the skeleton over a lifetime. The grandmother's bones were the bones of people who moved through the world. Just the granddaughter's bones were the bones of people who were bound to a particular patch of it. This is what the drift looked like from the inside, not a choice, a gradual narrowing, a world that had been wide becoming specific, a life that had been varied becoming fixed, the range of food shrinking from dozens of sources to a handful. The range of movement shrinking from hundreds of miles to the distance between the house and the field. The range of possibility for the body, for the day, for the life, contracting around the grain that had to be planted, tended, harvested, ground, and eaten, so that there would be enough people and enough strength to plant, tend, harvest, grind, and eat it again next season. The women of Abu Huraira kneeled for hours every day because there was no other way to feed everyone. And there was no other way to feed everyone because there were too many people to go back. And there were too many people to go back because the grain had made it possible to have more children and survive. And the grain had made that possible because someone, in a moment of drought and necessity, had scattered a handful of seeds into cleared ground and come back to find something waiting. One handful of seeds. 13,000 years ago. A world that had been free becoming, one season at a time, a world that was not. The dead keep records, not in words. The people we are talking about had no words to keep, but in bone, in tooth, in the quiet damage that a life leaves on the body that lived it. The first farmers left behind something more honest than any account they might have written. And their skeletons are still being pulled from the earth across the Fertile Crescent, across Europe, across every region where agriculture took hold. And what those skeletons say consistently across every site and every century of the transition is the same thing. Farming made people sick. Not immediately, not in a way anyone could have seen in a single lifetime, or even across several generations. But the record across thousands of years is unambiguous. In study after study, in site after site, the pattern repeats. The bodies of the people who adopted agriculture were smaller, weaker, more disease-ridden, and more physically broken than the bodies of the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Not marginally, measurably, significantly. The shift from a wild, varied diet to a settled, grain-dependent one wrote itself into human bone with a clarity that no ancient text could match. This is the body's verdict on the worst mistake in human history. Start with height, because height is the simplest thing a skeleton can tell you. The hunter-gatherers of the pre-agricultural Fertile Crescent were tall people. The men averaged around 177 centimeters, close to what a well-nourished modern European man stands today. The women were proportionately robust, broad-shouldered, dense in the bone, in the way that a life of varied physical activity produces. Their height reflected what their bodies were built on: protein from wild game, fat from nuts and seeds, the full spectrum of nutrients that a varied diet running to dozens of different food sources provides. When farming arrived, not immediately, but across the generations of the transition, the people got shorter. By the time agriculture had been established for several thousand years, the average height of farming populations across Europe and the Near East had dropped by between 8 and 14 centimeters depending on the region. 8 to 14 centimeters, the equivalent of going from the average height of a modern Dutchman to the average height of a modern Bolivian. Not because the genetics changed. When researchers compare the genetic potential for height written into ancient DNA against the height those people actually achieved, early farmers were consistently shorter than their own genes suggested they should have been. The food was failing them. The bodies were being built on less than they needed. It would take 10,000 years, all the way to the 20th century with its modern medicine and its global food supply, for human height to fully recover to what it had been before the first field was ever cleared. The teeth tell a harder story. A diet built around grain is a diet built around fermentable carbohydrates, sugars that feed the bacteria in the mouth that produce acid that dissolves enamel. Hunter-gatherers eating meat and nuts and wild plants had remarkably clean teeth. Cavities were rare in pre-agricultural populations, not absent, rare. The mouths of the Natufians, their teeth preserved in their skulls 10,000 years later, still speak of relative health. The mouths of early farmers speak of something else. At Çatalhöyük, the 9,000-year-old settlement in central Turkey, where 8,000 people lived and stacked against each other on the plains of Anatolia, between 10 and 13% of adult teeth showed cavities. That number climbed as the settlement aged, and the grain dependency deepened. The women fared worse than the men, because the women were the ones grinding. Hours every day, kneeling over stone querns, turning grain into flour for the settlement to eat. The grinding was not gentle work. It wore the teeth down in specific, recognizable patterns. It deformed the knees and the lower back. It rounded the shoulders forward. The skeletons of the women who ground the grain at Çatalhöyük carry the shape of that labor in their very bones, a permanent record of what the agricultural life demanded of the bodies that maintained it. Tooth decay. In the world before agriculture was an exception, in the world after it, tooth decay became so common that historians would eventually give it a name, a disease of civilization. The first civilization, still with us. There is a mark that appears in the teeth of people who experience serious stress during childhood. Not a surface mark, not something that can be cleaned away, but a groove cut into the enamel itself during a period when the body's resources were so strained that normal tooth development was interrupted. It is called an enamel hypoplasia, a scar in the tooth from a childhood bad enough to leave a permanent record. In the hunter-gatherer populations of the pre-agricultural world, these marks appear occasionally. And childhood was hard. It has always been hard. And some children went through episodes of illness or near starvation severe enough to leave their trace. At Çatalhöyük, virtually every adult examined showed these marks. Not some, not most. Virtually every one, which means that virtually every child who grew up in this settlement, the world's first attempt at urban life, the great experiment in what it meant to stay in one place and grow your food, experienced at least one episode of physical crisis severe enough to interrupt the growth of their teeth. Famine, disease, nutritional collapse. Something bad enough to stop the body in its tracks, leave a groove in the enamel, and move on. Whatever it was, it came for almost everyone. This is what the agricultural life looked like from inside a child's body. The bones thickened once, and in response to movement. Hunter-gatherers who walked long distances, who carried loads, who climbed and dug and processed food by hand, built dense, strong bones, the kind that bears weight without fracturing, the kind that lasts. Studies comparing the leg bones of pre-agricultural people from around 7,000 years ago to those of farmers from the same region 6,000 years later found a difference of roughly 20% in bone density. The foragers' bones were 20% stronger, the equivalent, researchers noted, of what an average person would lose after 3 months of complete weightlessness. The farmers were not weightless. They worked hard, often brutally hard, at the repetitive labor that farming demands. But it was a different kind of work, narrow, repetitive. The same muscles, the same joints, the same daily posture, over and over, instead of the varied full body, constantly changing physical demands of a life spent moving through a wide world. The bones recorded it all. Then the animals arrived, and with the animals came something the human body had never encountered at scale before. When people began keeping goats and cattle and pigs in close quarters, when the pen was built next to the house, when the animals slept near the people who depended on them, when their waste accumulated in the same tight spaces where children played, a new kind of relationship began between human bodies and the microbes that lived in animal bodies. Diseases that had previously stayed in their animal hosts found a new route. Influenza, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, plague in its earliest form already appearing in Neolithic settlements. Yet each of these, and dozens more, made the jump from livestock to human, because the agricultural life had placed human bodies in permanent, intimate proximity to animal bodies for the first time in the history of the species. The hunter-gatherer, who killed a wild animal and ate it, had a brief, terminal encounter with whatever that animal carried. The farmer who lived beside the same species for generations, who breathed its air and handled its waste and drank its milk and let his children play in the pen, gave every pathogen those animals harbored the time and the access to adapt, to spread, to become eventually a human disease. The Neolithic settlements were the world's first disease incubators. Not because the people were dirty or careless, because the logic of the agricultural life, stay close to your animals, and stay close to your fields, stay close to your settlement, was also inescapably the logic of epidemic disease. You cannot have one without the other. It is worth pausing here in the middle of all this ruin, to say something clearly. The people who became farmers did not fail. They were not weak or foolish or less than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. They were human beings responding reasonably to the conditions they found themselves in, managing what they could, adapting where they had to, making do with what the life they had inherited required. They were also, by every biological measure their skeletons preserve, paying a price their grandparents had not paid. A price they could not see, because they had no way to compare their bodies to the bodies of the people who came before them. They only knew their own lives, their own teeth, their own children's stunted growth. And here is what makes this cost so important to understand. It was not an accident of a particular place or a particular crop. The same pattern of declining health appears everywhere agriculture spread, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, in Africa. Every society that made the shift from foraging to farming went through a version of the same biological deterioration. Shorter bodies, weaker bones, more cavities, more childhood stress marks, more infectious disease. 19 of the 21 ancient societies studied in the most comprehensive survey of this question showed clear evidence of declining health after the agricultural transition. 19 out of 21. The same mistake, the same price, written in bone all over the world. The body knew. The body always knew. It just had no way to refuse. 8,000 years ago, in the Jordan Valley, someone built a wall. Not a garden wall, not a boundary marker between neighbors. A stone fortification 4 meters high, backed by a watchtower nearly 9 meters tall, the equivalent of a 3-story building, with a ditch cut through solid bedrock running around the perimeter of the entire settlement. The ditch alone, cut from bedrock, by people using stone tools in a world without metal, without wheels, without any of the machinery we associate with construction at scale. The labor that went into that ditch was staggering. The people who did it were not building to honor their gods. They were not building to mark a sacred site or to bury their dead with ceremony. They were protecting something. This is ancient Jericho, 8,000 BCE. And the question that the wall poses, the question that has no comfortable answer, is what exactly in this early farming settlement was so valuable that thousands of hours of brutal labor in solid rock seemed like a reasonable price for its protection. There were no gold mines in Jericho, no gemstones, no metal wealth of any kind. There was grain, stored grain, in sealed pits beneath and beside the houses, representing months of food for the thousands of people who lived behind that wall. And grain, it turns out, changes everything. Picture the world before the grain pit existed. A band of 30 hunter-gatherers moves through the Fertile Crescent. They eat well. Gazelle, wild grain, almonds, pistachios, the seasonal variety of a generous landscape. But their food is scattered across hundreds of miles of territory, and it moves. The gazelle herd is 20 miles east today. The nut trees are productive this valley and stripped bare the next. No single person in this band can place themselves between the food and the people who need it, because the food is never in one place long enough to guard. You cannot monopolize a gazelle herd. You cannot tax the pistachio trees. The moment someone tries to accumulate more than their share, the rest of the band simply walks in a different direction and finds the same food somewhere else. This is not just a practical observation. It is the deepest structural fact of the pre-agricultural world. Power in any society flows from control of something people need. And for 300,000 years of human life, what people needed could not be controlled. It was too scattered, too mobile, too abundant across too wide a landscape for any person or group to corner it, which meant that the structural conditions for domination simply did not exist. Now put those same people in a farming settlement, put their food in a pit The pit is full, 3 months of harvest, dried and sealed, enough to carry the settlement through the winter and into the next planting season. It does not move. It cannot scatter. It sits in a fixed location, in a fixed settlement, belonging to people who cannot leave it behind, because without it, they will starve before the next harvest arrives. Now imagine you are hungry, and the pit is not yours. You have 2 options. You can ask, or you can take. If you ask, whoever controls access to the pit can set a condition. Some labor owed, some portion of your own future harvest promised, some acknowledgement that they have something you need and you must deal with them to get it. If you take, the people who control the pit will stop you, because the pit is the difference between their survival and their starvation, and they will protect it with everything they have. This is the moment something entirely new enters the human story. Not just food, leverage, the structural ability of one person to make another person's survival conditional on their compliance. It did not require cruelty. It did not require any unusual ambition or malice. It required only a pit full of grain and a person standing between it and the people who needed it. Watch what happens next, because this is where the mechanism deepens. The person guarding the grain needs to eat while they guard it. They are not farming. Guarding is their contribution to the settlement's survival. So the farmers feed them from the surplus, a small portion of each harvest set aside for the guard. The guard is now a specialist, the first non-farming person in human history, fed by other people's labor because the protection they provide is worth more than what they eat. Now the harvest comes in again. It is larger this year. Good rains, good soil. There is more surplus than the settlement needs. The surplus sits in the pit. The guard watches it. And a neighboring settlement, which had a dry year and whose own pit is nearly empty, sends people to ask for grain. The guard, or the family or clan that controls access to the pit, can give the grain, or withhold it, or loan it at a price. A portion of next year's harvest, or labor during the planting season, or some acknowledgement of obligation that makes the borrowing settlement dependent on the lending one. They loan it, because loaning is more powerful than giving. Giving ends the relationship. Loaning begins 1. And now the settlement with the full pit has something entirely new. Not just food. A claim on another community's future labor. A debt denominated in grain that will be repaid with grain produced by people who work land they do not control for the benefit of people who do. This is rent. This is tax. This is interest. All of it, every extractive mechanism that human civilization has ever devised, is already present in this transaction. 2 Neolithic farming settlements, one with a full grain pit and one with an empty one, negotiating the terms on which hunger will be relieved. Inside the settlement itself, the same logic was pressing on the social fabric from within. Not every family farmed the same land. The land around a settlement varied. Some soil richer, some parcels closer to water, some slopes better sheltered from the seasonal winds. The families who farmed the better land grew more grain. They stored more. They could afford to feed more children, who survived to farm more land, who grew more grain still. Within a few generations, without any dramatic event, without any act of deliberate dispossession, the gap between the family on the good land and the family on the thin soil was compounding. And here is what made this different from anything that had come before. The advantage stayed. A nomadic hunter's skill and knowledge died with him. His children started over, now roughly equal to everyone else's children, in a world that distributed its resources across hundreds of miles of terrain. But land sits still. A grain pit stays in the family. The surplus that accumulates from good land in one generation becomes the seed corn that plants more good land in the next. The advantage passes from parent to child the same way the land itself does. It becomes heritable. It becomes structural. By the early Neolithic in Europe, The skeletons were already showing it. Men buried with the stone adzes that marked their status as landholders showed, in the very chemistry of their bones, access to better food than the men buried without those tools. In the same settlements, in the same communities, at the same moment in history. Not a different civilization. The same village. Two men, side by side in death, whose lives had been fundamentally different because one family had arrived first, or been stronger, or simply been luckier when the land was first divided and the advantage began to compound. This was 7,000 years ago. The seeds of inequality, as one researcher put it, were sown in the Neolithic. And after that, there was no looking back. The wall at Jericho was the visible expression of everything that had been happening invisibly inside the settlements for centuries. 2,000 to 3,000 people lived within it. 2,000 to 3,000 people's worth of food to store, protect, manage, and distribute. 2,000 to 3,000 people's worth of disputes about who owned what, or whose harvest was whose, which family's land ended where another's began. And outside the wall, as other farming communities, pressing against the same limited land, dependent on the same stored grain, some of them hungry in the years when the rain failed, looking at what was inside. The wall said something. It said there was a line, and on one side of that line was ours, and on the other side was yours. And we were prepared to use the watchtower and the ditch and whatever men we could arm to maintain that distinction. Hunter-gatherers had almost never needed to say this. Not at this scale, not with this permanence. Because there had been almost nothing concentrated enough, fixed enough, valuable enough to require a permanent fortification in its defense. You cannot fortify a gazelle herd. You cannot build a wall around a wild grain stand. The landscape was too vast and the food too dispersed for any one community to hold against another. But a grain pit you can wall, and once you build the wall, you have formalized something that had been growing in the social fabric for generations, the division between those who have the surplus and those who need it, between those who set the terms and those who must accept them, between those who stand at the gate and those who wait outside it. Every hierarchy that history has ever produced, every king, every landlord, every creditor, every tax collector, every man with a sword who stood between hungry people and the food they needed, is the logical extension of the man who first stood watch over a grain pit in a Neolithic farming settlement and realized that what he was guarding was not just food, it was power. And power, once discovered, has never been willingly surrendered. This is what the agricultural revolution actually built. Not civilization in the sense of human flourishing, not progress in the sense of things getting better for most people. It built the structural conditions under which one person's survival could be made conditional on another person's compliance. It built the first mechanisms of extraction, the debt, the rent, the tax, that would grow and elaborate and formalize across the millennia into the economic systems that govern the world today. It built the wall, and the army, and the state, and every institution designed to protect the surplus of those who have it from the hunger of those who don't. All of it, every piece, traceable to a pit full of dried grain in a fixed location, and belonging to people who could not leave it. The woman in the field at Çatalhöyük, pressing the harvest to her chest, glad, could not have known that what she was holding was the seed of her own subjugation. Not hers alone, everyone's. The surplus she was growing would eventually feed someone whose entire purpose was to make sure she kept growing it. The land she was tending would eventually be claimed by someone whose children would inherit the claim. The food that was keeping her alive would eventually become the instrument by which people like her would be kept in their place. She didn't know. None of them did. The worst mistakes never announced themselves. The agricultural revolution made people shorter. It rotted their teeth, thinned their bones, filled their settlements with disease, and handed the surplus they grew to the people who controlled the land they grew it on. All of that we have seen. But there is one more cost, one that took longer to build, and when it arrived its scale. Farming didn't just change what people ate and how they lived and who held power over them. It changed what they were willing to do to each other. Picture a valley in Central Europe, 5,000 years ago. The soil here is the deep, dark loess that early farmers prized above everything, loose enough to work with a simple wooden tool, rich enough to produce reliable harvests for generations without exhausting itself. A river runs along the valley's eastern edge, wide enough to water livestock and catch fish in the lean months. Oak and beech forests climb the slopes on either side, now already pushed back by 3 generations of clearing. Fields run right to the tree line now, neat strips of cultivated ground that catch the morning light differently from the forest floor, a patchwork of worked earth spreading across the valley floor from one end to the other. The settlement sits at the center. Mud brick houses press close together, their rooftops visible from the ridge above. Smoke rising from cooking fires, children running between the houses, dogs, the smell of grain drying in the late summer air, the sound of grinding stones, the daily work of turning wheat into flour, hours of it, every morning before anything else can begin. This community has been here for 3 generations. The grandparents came first, found the valley, cleared the first fields. Their children extended those fields to the edge of the good soil. Their grandchildren farm every strip of productive ground that the valley contains. The forest beyond the cleared land is too poor for grain. The soil under it too thin, the drainage wrong. This valley, these fields, this settlement, this is the whole world, and it is full. Now look at the ridge at the valley's western edge. On the other side of that ridge is another valley, almost identical. The same soil, the same river, the same cleared fields running to the same tree line. The people who live there speak the same language, shape their pottery the same way, bury their dead with the same rituals. They are cousins, perhaps literally. Their grandparents came from the same original settlement, splitting a generation ago when the first valley filled and some families crossed the ridge to find new land. That was 3 generations ago. Now both valleys are full. Every productive stretch of ground on both sides is already planted. The forest has been pushed back as far as the soil allows. The populations on both sides have grown, steadily, inevitably, in the way that agricultural populations always grow when the food is reliable, and the women can wean their children sooner and have the next one faster. More people on this side, more people on the other side. The same fixed amount of land between them. Then, the summer rains fail. One dry summer is manageable. There is grain in the pit from last year. There are animals to slaughter earlier than planned. There are wild plants at the forest edge to supplement the reduced harvest. Uncomfortable, but survivable. The community tightens its portions. The children eat first. The elders eat less. Everyone watches the sky. The calculation, though, is now tight. And on the other side of the ridge, the calculation is equally tight. Both communities look at their stores and understand the same thing. If the rains fail again next year, what is in the pit will not be enough. One valley can feed one community through a hard season, not 2. They cannot expand. There is no land left to clear within reach of the settlement. They cannot move. The population is too large, the grain too rooted in the ground, the infrastructure of the settlement too fixed to be abandoned. They cannot borrow indefinitely from neighbors who are themselves pressed by the same failing rains. But across the ridge, there are fields, a grain pit, a community roughly the size of their own, and the calculation that forms, slowly, in the minds of people who are not monsters, who are trying to feed their children, is this: if we take their land and their stores, we have enough. If we don't, we might not. This is not hatred, not glory, not some darkness specific to these particular people on this particular ridge. It is arithmetic, fixed land, growing population, limited stores, and the knowledge that the land that feeds your neighbor is the land you need. The knowledge that a farming community, unlike a nomadic band, cannot simply relocate when the pressure becomes unbearable. They are rooted, which means they can be removed. Around 5,000 years ago, in what is now Austria, what happened next left no survivors to describe it. Armed men came at dawn or in the night and went through the village systematically. The men of fighting age were killed first, their skulls caved in by stone axes from behind as they ran or were caught. The old were killed where they stood. The children, old enough to remember, old enough to grieve, old enough to one day return for revenge, killed. The young women and the small children were taken, the houses were emptied. And then, whoever came left, with the people they had chosen to keep, leaving behind only the bodies in the fields. The bodies of at least 67 people were found centuries later in a ditch, lying where they fell, skulls showing multiple blows, bones showing the marks of animals that reached them before anyone buried them. No young women, no children between 9 and 16, not killed, taken. This is Aspern-Schletz, one of several sites from this period in Central Europe where the same story plays out in bone and silence. A farming village, completely destroyed, not raided, replaced. The people who did this were not trying to kill everyone. They were trying to replace a community. Then settle the land, plant the fields, store the grain. People have always been capable of killing each other. Violence is as old as the species. The bones of pre-agricultural people show injuries, fights, feuds, the occasional lethal encounter between bands. Hunter-gatherers were not peaceful saints, but the mass graves appear with the farms. To understand why, you only need to ask what a nomadic band is actually fighting over, and what it isn't. A band moving through a wide landscape has almost nothing that an enemy can permanently take. You can kill people. You can take their weapons, their tools, their smoked meat. But the land itself, the rivers, the forests, the wild grain stands, cannot be seized and held. The moment you stop camping on a piece of ground, it returns to being simply land, available to anyone who passes through. The nomad's most valuable possession is knowledge, where the herds go, which plants come first, how to read the sky and the seasons. Kill the person, and the knowledge dies with them. But you still don't control the land. There is nothing to control. The land doesn't stay. This is why nomadic violence, when it happened, was usually bounded. Raids, feuds between specific families, violence that served a specific purpose and then subsided. Not campaigns of extermination, not the systematic destruction of entire communities. Agricultural land is different. Agricultural land stays. The cleared field stays. The grain pit stays. The productive soil that took 3 generations to establish stays, and it will feed whoever farms it next. This is what the agricultural revolution invented when it invented farming. Not just food production, not just surplus, not just hierarchy and disease and shorter bodies and harder lives. It invented the logic under which erasing an entire community becomes rational, under which the worst thing you can do to your neighbors, kill the men, take the women, burn the houses, plant your own grain in their field, is also, from a certain terrible angle, the most efficient response to a bad harvest and a boundary that cannot be pushed any further. The mass graves of Neolithic Europe are not an anomaly in the agricultural story. They are its logical conclusion. Jericho built its wall. The Neolithic farmers of Central Europe built their enclosures, the ditched and palisaded perimeters that enclosed their settlements in exactly the way you enclose something you are afraid of losing. Everywhere that agriculture established itself, the archaeology eventually finds the same signature: fortification, weapons designed for human targets, and somewhere nearby, a pit full of grain worth killing for. The Natufians of 12,000 years ago, tall, healthy, working 20 hours a week to feed themselves from the breadth of a wild landscape, had none of this. Not because they were better people, because the structure of their world made it unnecessary. You cannot solve a resource problem by erasing a mobile community, because the community's resources move with them. The problem returns the moment you stop chasing them. The only resource worth erasing someone for is one that stays behind when they are gone. The farm stays, the field stays, the grain pit stays. And so, from the moment the first farming communities pressed against each other across a shared valley boundary, the oldest and most persistent template of human conflict was laid down. Not hatred between strangers, not the chaos of disorder. It is something colder and more durable, the methodical elimination of competing claims on fixed, productive land. We have been living inside that template ever since. Everything we have covered so far, the shrinking bodies, the rotting teeth, the grain pits, and the guards and the mass graves in Austrian ditches, all of it happened before what we normally call civilization began. Before the pyramids, before the written word, before the first kings and the first empires and the first cities, large enough to be called cities in any sense we would recognize today. Those things were still coming, and when they arrived with a grandeur that has dazzled every generation since: towering temples, organized armies, laws written in stone, art of breathtaking sophistication, the full flower of everything the human mind can produce when it is freed from the immediate demands of survival and given the resources to think, to build, to imagine. This is what we call civilization. And for most of human history, this is what we have pointed to when we want to justify the agricultural revolution. When we want to say that yes, perhaps the transition was hard, perhaps there were costs, but look at what it produced. Look at Sumer. Look at Egypt. Look at what human beings built when they had surplus and scale and time. What we are about to see is what that argument leaves out. Around 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years after the first walls rose at Jericho, and 6,000 years after the builders of Göbekli Tepe raised their first pillar, something unprecedented took shape on the floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. A city. Not a settlement of hundreds like Çatalhöyük. Not a fortified village of thousands like Jericho. A city of tens of thousands. Eventually, 40,000 people within its walls, with another 30 or 40,000 more in the towns and villages of the surrounding countryside that fed it and depended on it and were governed by it. The city was called Uruk. It was, by every measure, the largest and most complex human settlement that had ever existed on Earth. Stand at its edge and look inward. The canals thread through the city, carrying water from the Euphrates to the fields and the workshops and the households packed along their banks. The smell of bread baking, of beer fermenting in great clay vats, of livestock penned near the walls. The sound of hammering from the bronze workshops, the potter's wheel turning in the ceramic district. The first potter's wheel ever used, invented right here in this city, by people who needed to produce bowls fast enough to feed an industrial population, and at the center of it all, rising 40 feet above the flat plain on a stepped brick platform that can be seen from miles away, the White Temple, its limestone walls coated in gypsum plaster, so white it blazes in the Mesopotamian sun like a signal fire, the home of Inanna, goddess of love and war, and the divine patron of the greatest city the world had ever seen. This is what the agricultural revolution built. This is the payoff. The surplus of grain across 10,000 years of farming compressed into one extraordinary moment of human achievement. Look at it. Let it be extraordinary. It is. Now walk inside the temple complex. The temple is not just a place of worship. It is the center of the city's economy. Every harvest in the region flows here first. Grain, wool, livestock, the products of the workshops. Temple officials record what comes in and what goes out. They calculate the rations for the laborers who built the White Temple, who tend the canals, who weave the textiles that Uruk trades across the ancient world. They track debts, obligations, the quantities owed by each village to the central administration. If they manage an economic system of extraordinary complexity, distributing resources across a population of tens of thousands, tracking every transaction, every obligation, every claim. And they have a problem. The problem is memory. A human mind can hold a certain amount of information, a few dozen names, a few hundred numbers, the obligations of a few score individuals. But the temple at Uruk is managing the economic life of a city of 40,000 people and a surrounding territory that feeds them. The debts are too numerous, the rations too complex, the transactions too many to hold in any single mind or any 10 minds or any roomful of minds working together. Something has to change. Some new technology has to emerge, capable of storing information outside the human brain, way of recording obligations that survive the death of the man who made them and the man who is owed, of tracking grain across seasons and years and the inevitable turnover of the administrators who count it. Watch what they invent. A scribe sits in the temple complex at Uruk. It is around 3,300 BCE. He has before him a small rectangle of wet clay, soft enough to mark, firm enough to hold the mark when it dries. In his right hand, he holds a reed stylus cut to a point. He presses the point into the clay at a specific angle, makes a series of marks, wedge shapes, lines, the simplified outlines of things that can be counted, and sets the tablet aside to dry. What he has just written is not poetry, not a prayer, yet not the record of a king's glory or a philosopher's thought, or any of the things we might imagine as the first impulse of the written word. It is a receipt for barley. The tablet records that a certain quantity of grain has been delivered to the temple storehouses from a particular source on a particular date, to be credited against an obligation that is also recorded. It is an administrative document, a piece of bureaucratic paperwork, and it is, along with the thousands of similar tablets found at Uruk and across the ancient Near East, the oldest writing in the history of the world. Let that land. The first writing ever produced by human beings. The technology that would eventually carry every story, every law, every poem, every idea that survived antiquity, was invented to count grain, not to record thought. To administer extraction. The first scribes were not poets or priests composing hymns to the gods. They were accountants, tracking what the people who farmed the land owed to the people who controlled it. This is the reversal point. This is the moment when everything we have been building toward in this story snaps into focus. Go back to what we know about the world before farming. The Natufians who worked 20 hours a week and ate from the breadth of a wild landscape. The equality that was not a philosophy, but a structural fact. The consequence of food being too diffuse and too mobile to monopolize. The freedom that came not from any declaration, but from the simple reality that you could, at any moment, walk away from any arrangement that failed you. Now look at Uruk. 40,000 people, locked to the floodplain by the infrastructure of irrigation and surplus that feeds them, producing grain that flows to the temple, receiving back a ration, a standard-sized clay bowl of barley ladled out by the same administrative apparatus that tracked what they owed. working in the workshops, the fields, the construction projects that the temple administrators organize and the temple resources fund. Watched over by the priest king, who mediates between the city and its gods, who holds the authority to command and the surplus to reward compliance and punish defiance. Not slaves necessarily. Not in the chattel sense that later civilizations would refine and export across the ancient world. But not free either, in the sense that the Natufians were free. Free in the sense that a person who has no alternative is free, free to comply, us free to starve, free to be a unit in an administrative system that does not know their name, but does know, to the nearest measure of barley, what they are owed and what they owe. The scribe with his reed stylus does not know that he is administering the logical conclusion of a process that began at Göbekli Tepe 6,000 years before he was born. He does not know about the woman in the field at Çatalhöyük pressing grain to her chest, glad. He knows only the tablet in his hands and the numbers on it and the obligation he is recording for the man who controls the storehouses. But the chain is unbroken. The temple at Uruk was built with the surplus that farming produced. The surplus that farming produced was controlled by the people who organized the farming. The people who organized the farming derived their authority from the structural leverage that grain storage created. And grain storage, the whole long chain, began with the first woman who scattered seeds near a settlement in the Fertile Crescent and came back to find something waiting. The ziggurats of Sumer were built by corvée labor, workers conscripted from the surrounding communities to contribute their bodies to the construction projects of the temple state, fed from the temple's storehouses in exchange for the labor the temple extracted from them. The White Temple at Uruk required, by archaeologists' estimates, 1,500 workers laboring 10 hours a day for 5 years to complete just its outer stone facing. Those workers did not choose to be there in the way a person chooses a job today. They were there because the system they lived inside demanded their labor, fed them in return, and had no mechanism by which they could refuse. This is what the ziggurat is, when you strip away its beauty and its spiritual meaning, which were real and which should not be dismissed. It is the physical form of extraction made permanent. Stone and labor and surplus, organized by the same logic that put the first guard at the first grain pit, elevated now into architecture. The temple state takes in the grain. The temple state feeds the workers. The workers build the temple. The temple justifies the temple state. The circle is complete, self-reinforcing, and visible from 30 miles across the flat plain of Sumer. And Sumer is only the beginning. Egypt will follow its own agricultural surplus, organized under its own divine authority, and its own workers conscripted to build its own monuments of extraction. Then the empires, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, each one an elaboration of the same underlying structure. The surplus from the land, the authority over the surplus, the labor extracted in exchange for the right to eat. The monuments built with that labor, the laws written to codify that authority, the armies funded by that surplus to defend it and extend it. Every civilization that history records was built on this foundation. The agricultural revolution did not just create farming. It created the conditions under which a small number of people could organize the labor of a large number of people, extract a portion of what they produced, and use that extraction to build things. Temples, palaces, armies, and empires that no hunting band ever could have built. This is what we have been calling civilization. This is what the first scribes were administering when they pressed their reed style into wet clay and wrote the world's first words: numbers, grain, debt. Who owes what to whom? There is a line of time that stretches from the woman in the field at Çatalhöyük to the scribe at Uruk, and from the scribe at Uruk to every tax collector who ever lived, every rent due on a piece of land, every debt that could not be repaid, every laborer who worked ground they did not own for a portion of what it produced. 6,000 years separate the woman and the scribe. 6,000 years of the same logic compounding. More people, more surplus, more organization, more extraction, more monuments, more writing to track the extraction. More laws to legitimize it, more armies to enforce it. And at every stage, the people living inside the system were not making a catastrophic choice. They were responding reasonably to the conditions around them. The farmer grew grain because the grain was what the land was organized to produce. The scribe recorded the accounts because the accounts had to be kept. The laborer built the ziggurat because the ziggurat was what the city required of him. None of them stood outside the system and chose it. They were born inside it, shaped by it, made by it in the same way that the woman in the field was made by the drift that preceded her. The agricultural revolution is the worst mistake in human history, not because the people who made it were foolish or wicked. And it is the worst mistake because it was not a mistake at all. Not in the moment, not in any single step of the 10,000 years it took to build from the first scattered seeds to the first written receipt for barley in a temple storeroom in Sumer. Every step made sense. The sum was a world in which most people, for most of recorded history, lived shorter and harder and less free lives than the hunter-gatherers who came before them, and called it civilization. The first words ever written were not about beauty or love or the mystery of the stars. They were about who owed what to whom. Everything we have built since is a refinement of that original transaction. There's a question that sits underneath everything we have covered, and it has been waiting since the beginning of this story to be asked directly. If the agricultural revolution made people shorter and sicker and less free, if it invented hierarchy and war and the administrative extraction of surplus, if it traded the varied, generous world of the Natufians for a narrower, harder, more dependent one, if all of that is true, and the bones, the teeth, the mass graves, the tablets of Uruk confirm that it is, then why are we still doing it? Why is the whole world still farming? The answer is the same answer it has always been. Because the trap closed. Because by the time the costs were visible, the population that depended on the grain was already too large for the wildland to feed. Because the nomads were outnumbered and then absorbed and then forgotten. Because once a system reaches sufficient scale, the question of whether you endorse it becomes irrelevant. Yet you were born inside it. So were your parents. So were every human being alive today, and every human being who has lived since the first settlements took hold in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago. We are not descended from the people who chose to keep walking. We are descended from the people who stayed. Walk through a modern supermarket. Not to marvel at it, just to see it clearly. The shelves run in every direction, stacked floor to ceiling with products in bright packaging, an overwhelming abundance of choice that would have been incomprehensible to any person alive before the industrial age. And yet look more closely. Underneath the packaging, underneath the flavors and the branding and the 1,000 variations on a theme, what is actually there? Wheat, corn, rice, soy, and the same 4 crops dominate the caloric supply of the entire modern world. 4 plants. Out of the hundreds that the Natufians ate across a year, out of the 80 or more distinct food sources that fed a mobile band across a season, the global agricultural system has converged on 4. The supermarket that appears to offer everything is, at its nutritional foundation, narrower than the diet of a hunter-gatherer who worked 20 hours a week and never planted a seed. The diseases that kill most people in the modern world, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, tooth decay, are agricultural diseases, not in the sense that farming caused them directly, but in the sense that they are the diseases of a body running on a diet it was never fully designed to process. A diet built around refined grain carbohydrates that spiked blood sugar in ways that wild foods rarely did. The human body spent 300,000 years not eating this way. It has spent 10,000 years being asked to. It has adapted partially. But the diseases of civilization, the phrase itself tells you where they came from, are still with us. The average working week for most people on Earth is longer than the 20 hours a week the Kalahari Bushmen devote to finding food, significantly longer. The freedom that the pre-agricultural world provided, not wealth, not comfort, not security in the modern sense, but time, actual unencumbered human time, has never been returned to the majority of the people the agricultural revolution absorbed. The inequality that the first grain pit created has never been resolved. It has only elaborated. The mechanism is the same one that put the first guard at the first storage facility in the Neolithic Fertile Crescent. Whoever controls access to what people need to survive holds structural power over the people who need it. In the Neolithic, what people needed was grain. Today, what people need is a paycheck, which buys the food that the agricultural industrial system produces, which is owned and managed by corporations and states that hold the same structural position the temple administrators of Uruk held 5,000 years ago, between the production of food and the people who must eat it. The forms have changed beyond recognition. The logic has not moved. Land is still the foundation of wealth in most of the world. The people who own productive land are still, in aggregate, the people who hold disproportionate power over the people who do not. The debt that the first Neolithic communities began incurring from each other, grain borrowed against next year's harvest, became the financial systems that govern the modern world, still denominated ultimately in the claim that some people have over the future labor of others. The walls of Jericho became the borders of nation-states. The guards at the grain pit became the armies and the police forces that enforce property rights and territorial claims that trace back in an unbroken line to the first time someone decided that a fixed piece of productive land belonged to them and not to anyone else. None of this is to say that all of it is wrong, or that modern states are the moral equivalent of Neolithic raiding parties. The elaboration has produced things of genuine value: medicine, sanitation, the reduction of violence at the individual level, lifespans that the Natufians could not have imagined. The story is not simple. It was never simple. But the foundation has not changed. And if you want to understand why the world is organized the way it is, why some people work and some people don't have to, why some land is owned and some is not, why debt is the organizing principle of so much human economic life, the answer begins in a grain pit in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago. Return to her. The woman in the field, the grain heavy in her hands, 3 months of labor, the storage pit full. 8,000 people breathing the same smoky air above the rooftops of the settlement she cannot leave. Her teeth beginning to ache from a diet she has no name for, from a process she has no way to see. Her children slightly shorter than her grandparents were. Her neighbor's skull bearing a healed dent from a clay ball fired from behind. She presses the grain to her chest. She is glad. She didn't choose the trap. She was already inside it before she knew it existed. Every step she had taken in her life, every season of planting, every harvest, every child she had weaned onto grain porridge sooner than her grandmother had weaned hers. Every year the settlement grew by a few more houses and the wild land around it shrank by a few more cleared fields. Every step had been reasonable. Had been, in its moment, the right thing to do. The only thing to do? The trap had no single closing moment, no hinge, no lock, no key. Only the slow accumulation of sensible decisions, each one narrowing the world a little further, until the world that remained was the only world there was. She made us, all of us. Every person alive today is the product of a line of people who made the same choices she made, or who were absorbed by the people who did. The Natufians who kept walking are not our ancestors. We are the children of the ones who stayed, who planted, who built, who depended, who could not go back. And we have never gone back. We have only gone forward, elaborating and refining and expanding the original bargain. More people, more grain, more surplus, more extraction, more complexity. In every direction the human mind can reach, until the bargain is so old and so total that we have forgotten it was a bargain. We call it civilization. We call it history. We call it the world. The agricultural revolution is the worst mistake in human history, not because the people who made it were wrong in any moment they could have understood, not because there was a better choice visible to anyone living through it, but because of what it cost, and because the cost was paid not by a generation or a century, but by every human being who has lived since. Paid in shorter lives and harder bodies, and the structural violence of a world organized around the control of what people need to survive. The first farmers of the Fertile Crescent could not have known this. The builders of Göbekli Tepe could not have seen where the gatherings they organized would lead. The woman in the field could not have felt the trap closing around the grain in her hands. But we can see it. We are standing far enough back, with enough of their bones and their tablets and their walls and their mass graves laid out before us, to see the whole shape of what happened. To trace the line from the first scattered seeds, to the first receipt for barley, to the world we woke up in this morning. The question is not whether we could have done otherwise. We couldn't. The question is whether, now that we can see it, whether, now that we hold all of this in view, we understand something true about the world we inherited. The trap didn't close because anyone chose it. It closed because every single step along the way felt exactly like progress. It still does.